Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Jonathan Tallant, who is the author of this book, Metaphysics: An Introduction, which is on the reading list for a bunch of philosophy courses. So for those of you who like to read philosophy books, it might be a good textbook to invest in. And Jonathan, a bit about your background. Is it right that you're still at Nottingham University at the moment?
Yeah, that's right. Still doing philosophy at Nottingham, enjoying myself very much.
How is lockdown going for you? Are you having to teach from home and everything and adapt in that way?
Yeah, so lockdown's interesting. I'm not doing any undergraduate teaching at the moment. I'm head of the School of Humanities, so I'm sitting in a lot of meetings, that kind of thing, rather than doing the teaching. Trying to support colleagues and students who are actually doing all that stuff, and then doing a bit of homeschooling as well, which of course adds another
Right.
layer of challenge onto all of that. So if we do get interrupted by a 10-year-old wandering in at any stage, my apologies.
Yeah, don't worry about it. I tend to keep things fairly kind of casual on the channel anyway, so it's not, like some people, if something little goes wrong or whatever, it's kind of like produced really well, whereas mine's kind of messy and not produced as well. So anyway, we're going to be talking about metaphysics today, and I suppose at like a broad level. I mean, what is metaphysics? Because people will sort of use words like, ontology or committing objects to our ontology. Uh, and it can be quite kind of foreign to maybe someone on the outside who's not familiar with the philosophy jargon. So where does kind of metaphysics fit into philosophy, and what are we trying to do when we do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I really love the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on metaphysics by Peter Van Inwagen and Megan Sullivan. And the opening line of that entry on metaphysics is, "It's not easy to say what metaphysics is," which I think is just a great way to start an article on metaphysics. I guess really metaphysics is trying to study the nature and structure of reality and work out what there is, but with an intention of trying to be at any rate a little bit broader than physics. So there might be various different claims that we want to make, and I'm sure we'll come on to those as we go through the rest of the podcast, where we're not necessarily talking about things that are observable, but we might have some reasons to posit those things. Now, of course, as soon as we're talking about things that aren't observable, we're reaching beyond the bounds of what physics might be able to tell us, or other sciences and so on. And so then we're doing something that might be called metaphysics. And I guess then we've got questions around, what do we mean by ontology, and how do things connect up to other disciplines in philosophy? So the way that the difference between metaphysics and ontology was described to me, and that I quite like, is ontology is a study of what exists. So if you're saying that you're admitting something into your ontology, you're effectively taking it and you're putting it in the category of things that you're happy, those are the things that exist. Now, as well as saying there are these things, there are people, there are chairs, there are tables, there are quarks and leptons and so on, we might also want to talk about the structure and nature of those things. So we might want to talk about things being charged particles, or there being similarities of kinds between various different things. And there we're stepping outside the realm of ontology, and we're starting to think about the structure of reality. And so then we're doing metaphysics that isn't also ontology. So I guess that's how I'd see that difference coming to bear. And then you asked that great question about, well, okay, so how do we connect metaphysics to the rest of what's going on in philosophy? Right. And that's a great question, and the answer is horrendously long. But very, very roughly, the idea would be that because metaphysics is looking at the nature, structure of things that exist, and through ontology trying to work out what exists, it's really hard to do any other bit of philosophy without touching on various bits of metaphysics or making various bits of metaphysical assumption. So, for instance, suppose that you wanted to do some thinking about how language works. And you want to say, right, so we've got this idea about rain. Let's suppose that you and I are going to have a really exciting conversation about the weather today, because that's the sort of thing that we might do. It's raining outside. It looks really intuitive to say that we are entertaining the same thought. So there is a thought that we're both having. Okay, well, what do thoughts consist in? How do bits of language pick them out? What's the relationship between words or thoughts and things in the world? And of course, while we're starting to talk about relationships and things in the world, relations themselves might be entities, the things in the world are going to be entities. Now it looks like we're making some assumptions about the ontology and underlying metaphysics that's going on in there. So I don't think you can do metaphysics without really touching on all of those other areas of philosophy, but equally I don't think you can do any of those other areas of philosophy without touching on metaphysics. So yeah, it's a big complicated mess.
Is a metaphysical view a sort of model of reality? And if so, how does it differ from like a scientific model of reality? Or, you know, like if we were comparing metaphysical explanations about things, how would that differ from the way we might consider scientific, how does that differ from the way we might evaluate scientific explanations of events and things?
Yeah, great. So let's start off with those models that we were talking about there. So one thing that metaphysicians sometimes do is they try and come up with what we might call categorical schemes. So there's category metaphysics is a way of sort of articulating this notion. And one question that we might then ask ourselves is to focus in a little bit on the natures of entities, and then ask what exactly is involved in their having the natures that they do. So let's suppose that we take my ever so exciting coffee cup here. We say it's white, right? It's got the property of being white. We could do some physics to understand what that consists in, be having some particular propensity to reflect a given wavelength of light. Fantastic. But that looks to be, I mean, looks superficially to be repeatable. So the whiteness of my coffee cup could be repeated on another coffee cup in the kitchen that I've got. That one's actually clean in the kitchen. Okay, great. So when we're saying it's repeatable, do we mean it's strictly and literally the same property of being white? Or do we mean that there's a superficial kind of resemblance or a really close resemblance between these two things? Because if we think that there's strictly and literally the same property in both places, now it begins to look, at least from the language that we're using, like there really is some feature, some property of the coffee cup that's not only in my coffee cup here with me as I'm talking to you, it's also in the coffee cup away down there in the kitchen. Now that's to put an entity into the world, right? That's to say that there is this property of whiteness that really resides in the world. So now our categorical scheme's got properties in it, and we've also got things in it. Now, of course, when you go to do the physics of those sorts of things, you won't start to consider the questions about whether or not there really is a literally repeatable property that's in the kitchen, in the study. What you'll just do is talk about the kind of the functional way that feature will behave in the world, I guess. So that's sort of a starter for the way we might start to think about that.
And what should the sort of interplay be between our kind of best sciences then and metaphysics? Like, you know, are there metaphysical assumptions going on in order to do science, or should science overthrow our kind of metaphysical assumptions? And like, do they both progress together? Are they in conflict? I guess maybe some people might be inclined to think of, like, you know, the history of metaphysics and scholasticism and that sort of thing, and think, oh, you know, metaphysics is bad, no good, or whatever. But then equally, I don't know, some people might be using metaphysical arguments to try and reach certain conclusions about parapsychology or religious apologists and stuff like that. And then a knowledge of philosophy and metaphysics is actually useful to be able to say, well, maybe we shouldn't believe in this phenomena as like demon possession or something. And their metaphysics might be useful as opposed to do something that a scientific explanation can't. So what's the interplay between our best kind of sciences and what we do in metaphysics, trying to come up with explanations?
That's great. So I think that the way that it works best is when science and metaphysics are in dialogue with one another. I think that's when you get the best results coming out for both sides of that coin. And I do think they are both sides of the same coin, right? So both metaphysics and physics are trying to work out what there is in the world, and the other sciences as well. I just tend to focus on the physics. Right. But I think that it's hard to do one without also doing the other. So I mean, just, you know, super toy kind of examples, but if you're going to do metaphysics and you talk about properties and features of things, as I was a minute ago, you probably want to be studying real live scientific examples of properties and features that we know that the world has. So what a great idea to go away, understand the science, and then think about those properties and see what we want to say about those. That strikes me as absolutely the right way to go. But equally, I think that if you're going to do physics, then or engage in any of the sciences, thinking about the sort of questions that we might in metaphysics is also potentially going to be very useful. And if we start to think about I don't know. Something that I've been really interested in recently is the way in which our best science may or may not suggest that reality is timeless.
Okay.
Now, if you want to do that, then you've got to tell some kind of underlying story about where apparently timeful worlds like ours come from, right? So the underlying structure of reality might be timeless, but we seem to have a timely world. So what do we want to say? Typically that there's some kind of emergence, that our timely world emerges from an underlying and fundamental timeless structure. Fantastic. What's emergence? Because when you get into the metaphysics, right, emergence is a really interesting metaphysical notion where one thing emerges or supervenes, emerges from or supervenes on something else. That's a really interesting metaphysical notion of explanation that gets kicked about. So yeah, really fruitful interplay and scope for great conversations. I think where it tends to not be so productive is when either metaphysicians say, no, I don't need to know anything about your science, and vice versa.
Would you say that approximately the sort of explanatory virtues of like a metaphysical theory are the same as the scientific ones, or do they differ in any way? You know, in terms of maybe, I don't know if have you frozen there, or I wonder if that's. Have I frozen? Oh no, you're back.
Should just have popped back. There we go.
Yes, there we go. So would you say in terms of the sort of theoretical virtues that a scientific explanation might have and a metaphysical explanation, are they approximately the same sort of things? You know, if we're talking about like I don't know, like fit to the data or something, or parsimony, those sorts of things. Are there key differences between the two types of explanation? Like a metaphysical theory might have, you know, a good metaphysical theory might have property X or something, whereas a scientific one doesn't, or are they pretty much the same in those respects?
Yeah, good. So I think that a lot of the theoretical virtues and the ones that you've just been talking about are shared both by scientific theories and metaphysical theories. So you talked there about simplicity. I think it's pretty often taken to be the case, or parsimony, sorry. It's pretty often taken to be the case that the more parsimonious theory in science is taken to be the more virtuous, as long as it's explanatorily adequate. Same sort of thing would get said about a metaphysical theory, I think, as well. So certainly a good degree of overlap. I guess one significant difference where they're likely to come apart is going to be in terms of predictive power. So I think that normally what we would expect from a scientific theory is for it to make some prediction about how the world's going to unfold. Whereas I don't think we often ask that for philosophical theories, and physical theories in particular. We're not asking to make a prediction about, you know, if I drop the pen, what will happen? We're going to defer to the science for that kind of story and then try and work out an explanation from there. So I think that perhaps we might have slightly higher expectations or in that regard of our scientific theories. So yeah, but certainly a good degree of overlap in most of the theoretical virtues, I think.
Do you think, like, say in philosophy of mind, if we're talking about the types of things we should commit to our ontology, and someone wants to say, oh, well, I'm going to be a Cartesian duelist based off of metaphysical arguments. So they might make a prediction that if you separate the brain, the personality will stay the same as something. Whereas someone who's an emergentist might say, well, if you separate the corpus callosum, and I know it's not, what's the word? It's kind of, I can't think, where it's not clear where the data falls. I can't think of the word for some reason, but you know, you separate the corpus callosum, and potentially there's two kind of separate consciousnesses going on in that situation. Would that be like a prediction that metaphysics has made, or would you say actually that one of these is a metaphysical explanation, the other one's a scientific explanation? Like, where is the boundary between these two worlds?
Yeah, good. So I think in that kind of case where you've got there being so there's this consequence of dualism, I guess I'm not sure. I think that's a prediction that dualism is really looking to make, so much as an interesting side effect of the theory that falls out of things. But equally, I think that you're right to raise cases like that, because there are going to be things like other things that we want to say about the Cartesian case, like, well, how are we going to think about causal interaction between the mental and the physical? It looks like it's a prediction of Cartesian dualism, you might say, that there is this kind of interaction. So when you don't find it, that looks to then be a significant challenge to the Cartesian dualist. So I think that's a nice point. I guess when I was thinking a bit more about the sort of the specific mathematically codifiable predictions that the scientists will want to make. So we'd normally want to say that there'll be a particular acceleration or a particular magnitude that we can measure in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are going to be these kind of predictive consequences of philosophical and metaphysical theories.
So maybe a quite vague question to get us into some sort of metaphysics then. What is a fact?
Good. Well, so here depends who we want to talk to. So at least two different ways of thinking about this. For some people, facts are just going to be true propositions, so true things that we can say about the world. So I might say it's a fact that 2 + 2 = 4. It's a fact that Joe Biden's president of the United States. And by that, all I mean is it's a true thing that I can say about the world. Okay, so there's one thing we might mean. Other metaphysicians actually think that the world is made up of facts, and facts are worldly entities. So when I say that it is a fact that Joe Biden is the president of the United States, what I'm actually saying is there is a thing in the world. There is a state of Joe Biden's being president of the United States, and that thing is something we can call a fact. And it exists. It's out there. We can point at it and think about it.
So on that second view, I suppose the thought and the language are like a description of things in the world, and they're the facts, just states of affairs. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the facts are the states of affairs out there in the world, and what we end up with is our thoughts lining up, our thoughts and the way that we speak lining up really nicely with what there is in the world. Because we say, it's a fact that there is a president of the United States and it's Joe Biden. It turns out that there really is a thing out there in the world that is the fact of Joe Biden's being president of the United States. So, yeah, absolutely right.
And then in the book, you talk quite a lot about truth makers, and a lot of the kind of back and forth and discussion sort of it is based around trying to find truth makers for certain propositions in certain areas like time, causation, and so forth. What is a truth maker, and are there sort of other views that don't involve truth makers? Because I was thinking maybe, I think my introduction to philosophy was sort of more through like an idealism, where they'd want to say, well, that's the wrong sort of question because it's just another idea that you think about or something. So firstly, though, I suppose what is a truth maker, and what are we saying when we ask what's the truth maker for X?
Yeah, good. So if we start off by just thinking about lots of intuitive cases, that might give us a way in. So if I say that I'm sitting at a desk talking to you, then we might ask, okay, that's true, but in virtue of what's it true? What makes it true that I'm doing that? Well, part of what makes that true is going to be the fact that I'm sitting at a desk. So we need me to exist, we need my desk to exist, and we need to be some particular relations between me and the desk. Likewise, I say, if I say something like, there exists a pen. Okay, what makes that true? Why is that true? Well, because there is a pen, and there we go. That does it. That's what makes it true that there is a pen. And at its most intuitive level, I think that's what this talk of truth making is trying to get to. This fairly intuitive idea that when we say things about the world that are true, there exist things out there that make them true. And if the things that we say aren't true, then that's because there aren't things out there that are making them true. And so I think that folks of what might be called or deemed a realist metaphysical persuasion start from a fairly intuitive stock of cases, talk about pens and doormats and cats sitting on mats and all of the other really exciting examples that you see metaphysicians getting hung up on. And then they start to say, well, okay, look, if we think that that's right in these cases, then let's use that intuitive insight. Let's refine it into a theoretical tool, this sort of slightly more robust theorized notion of truth making that we can come on to. and then let's see how the world would have to be to make true our discourse about it. So you mentioned that in the book I talk about causation and time, and there are other discussions in there about talk about what's possible and what's necessary. So if we think that these truths that there are about what's possible, what's necessary, what causes what happened in the past, if they demand truth makers, if they demand existing things to make true our claims, then straight away there are a whole host of really interesting metaphysical questions that we can ask. Specifically, what makes it true that something's possible or necessary, or that something causes something else to occur? Now, you're absolutely right. There are other ways that one might proceed in metaphysics. One might sort of issue this talk of truth making altogether. I think there we're sort of into a metaphilosophical discussion about how we should try and do philosophy and how we should try and do metaphysics. But I guess the pushback on that kind of idealist approach to things would be to say that sort of requires us to not, well, on a really crude reading of some forms of idealism, that looks to require us to say that, look, right, it's not true that there's a table because there's a table. It's true that there's a table because of some thoughts, and we don't really think that's right. And you can observe that in all of our behaviors and so on and so forth. So that just looks to be a less plausible starting place, and then push that to one side and off we go. But that's a very dissatisfying dismissal of idealism, I realize.
I think around about 5% of my audience might be idealists or something. There's at least a small contingent, because I always see in the comments these back and forth discussions between people saying it seems so absurd, and people who are really sort of committed to those ideas.
I'll have offended the 5. I'll have offended the 5% now, and by the end of things, I'm sure I'll have got the other 95 as well. So it's all good.
So you sort of begin the discussion in the book with comparing positions like universalism, and again about language, about things, like tables and chairs. And I find it's interesting in almost all of these topics. It's very difficult to divorce one thing from the entire rest of a philosophy and worldview, sort of like you were talking about then when it comes to just talking about a particular concept of how we should approach metaphysics or truth makers or whatever. It's like everything else is almost tied in at once. You've got to take a worldview sort of as it is. Now, the position, the conversation about universals might be kind of strange maybe to some people at first who haven't done much philosophy before. What is it that we're talking about when we say, say this chair participates in chairness, maybe like a big P Platonism, or we say that there are chairs that really exist, or red is a real thing. What is the problem of universals, and what are the potential solutions to those problems?
Yeah, good. So we start off in cases like this with exactly the sort of thing we were talking about earlier with the cups, actually, than them both being white. Yeah. So we say that there really are, there's two things, both of which have the property of being a chair. And one other way to put it is to say there is something that these two chairs have in common, namely they are chairs. These two entities have in common, that is that they both have the property of being a chair. And just that way of regimenting the language suggests off the bat that there is something that they're both sharing in, that they're both partaking in, namely being a chair, having some property. Now, some folks are then inclined to say, okay, there really is such a property as being a chair or being white, or perhaps if those are the wrong targets to think about when we talk about properties, there is a property of being charged, property of having a particular mass. And those things are repeatable. So I can have a negatively charged particle and another negatively charged particle, and they're just instantiating the exact same property. One's doing it here, one's doing it there, one's doing it somewhere else, and so on. And for the Platonists about universals, they actually want to say it's those properties themselves are abstract objects. They're instantiated in the world, but then they also exist outside space and time. I can't say where they do exist, but it's just outside of space and time.
Yeah. So, and then sort of like maybe a nominalist might object to that point of view, right? And what would that competing worldview sort of look like?
Yeah, so nominalists deny that there are these repeatable entities that are properties, and they want to say that Really what's going on here is we've got cases of resemblance, or we've got cases of similarity, or it's much more to do with a feature of our language rather than a structural feature of the world, what we've got going on in these sorts of cases. So to come back to the charged particle, what we might say if we were a resemblance nominalist is to say, well, okay, look, you've got a particle, you've got another particle, you've got another particle, and so on and so on and so on and so on. When we say that they've all got the same property, what we really mean is just that they resemble one another in a particular sort of way, and that is with respect to being charged. Now, when it comes to adjudicating between those two views there, we then get off to all sorts of interesting discussions around theoretical virtues that you were touching on earlier. So, first of all, do we think the nominalist has given us the right sort of truth makers? Are they going to accurately reflect our language and what we want to say that is true and false about the world? Are they going to capture that? We also might want to ask whether or not the nominalist theory is appropriately parsimonious versus the Platonist view. We might want to ask if it gives us the right sort of explanation of other features in our science, and so on. So those are the sort of the two of the main competing views, and then we start doing some weighing of different theories via theoretical virtue.
What might it mean for something to exist that isn't sort of physical or matter, or like some of these abstract objects? I think some people might have a difficult time sort of thinking, well, I mean, it sort of exists as a thought, but isn't my thought sort of reducible to whatever's going on in my brain in some way? Or like what might it mean for the number 3 to really exist out there, and so in some non-spatial, it's not even out there, that's the wrong sort of predicate, right? So how might abstract objects exist? What does that really mean?
Giving a positive characterization of am I still there?
You chopped up at the start, but now you're back.
Okay. Giving a positive characterization of that's really hard. But I think one way to try and come at it is to think about, is to try and sort of play on your intuitive notions a little bit. So suppose that you think about, let's think about the whiteness in and of itself, right? The property of being white. Okay, now look, we all think we can come into contact with instances of it. Right, that's no problem at all. I can causally interact with instances of it, but whiteness itself, can I actually interact with that? Well, no, I'm not sure that would make much sense to me, how I would causally interact with that. I'm not sure I can get too much traction on that notion. So, okay, that's okay. Do I think that whiteness in and of itself has to be located? Well, I mean, maybe not. I can imagine this idea of whiteness, even if there were no white things, right? Even if there never had been, even if there never would be, the notion of whiteness still makes sense in and of itself. So that sort of suggests, at least one might think, that we don't need to think of white being located. We don't need to think about whiteness causally interacting with other things. So it's already kind of packed into our notion, might go the thought, that we don't think it has to have any of these features. So it's already packed into the notion itself that we can make sense of existing in some sense abstractly. But I can't tell you where it exists, because if I give it a location, then it becomes non-abstract. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So if we move into theories of time, then, as you said, some of the things you've been thinking about at the moment, and I think some of my audience will be familiar with some of this stuff from looking at William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, where made quite a lengthy video, around 7 hours, looking at how he sort of uses the A theory of time, but then also a lot of his the cosmological evidence that he relies on relies upon the B theory of time being true, and how there's potentially a kind of conflict in some of the ways he's arguing for his conclusions there. But to take a step back and look at time in general, as from like a metaphysics point of view, what are we talking about when we talk about theories of time? Is it McTaggart sort of is the sort of original guy who comes up with this A and B theory distinction to say, it's not real because neither of these work? Before him, are people thinking about time just in terms of sort of motion more? Is it only modern physics that brings about this sort of concept of time as a different thing. Like, can you talk about all this stuff a bit?
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
a lot built in.
Yeah, there's loads there. So I think it's fair to say that people have been thinking about time philosophically for at least a couple of thousand years. So we can go back to folks like Zeno and the paradoxes of motion, and we can go to folks like Heraclitus talking about not being able to step in the same stream twice, and time being a bit like an ever unfolding stream, and the Parmenidean notion of timelessness, and there just being the one, we're all part of, which I guess is a little bit of a foreshadowing of a kind of a timeless block structure-y notion of reality. So lots of thought going on back there, and I guess to the best of my knowledge, the first person to really give us the kind of really geometric underpinning to the notion of time that we deploy in our physics today. The first person to restart that, I think, was Nicolas Arém, French mathematician, scientist, philosopher, and he was, I think, the first person to compare time, or to actually represent time using a line, I believe. I'd love to be corrected, because that would be really, really interesting to find out where it comes from, or if it's not there. So that's that first, you can actually represent time using a line, and once you start doing that, then you can start having things like timelines, and once you've got timelines, then the four-dimensional structure becomes a bit more available and a bit more visualizable, and all those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, I think that's 1350. There's going to be someone who's going to pick up on my date. It's going to be really embarrassing. I should have just said old. That would have been fine. But around that kind of period, and then you get folks like Leibniz having a lot to say about the notion of time. Leibniz and Newton with relationalism and substantialism. So relationalism and absolutism. So is there some kind of structure or entity that is time, or does time just consist in relations between entities? And then, as you say, then you've got McTaggart and time's unreal because you've got an A series and a B series, and those two things can't be accommodated, and you need to have those things for time to be real. Yeah, so I mean, stacks of stuff that's happened with the concept of time.
Do you think, because I guess most of the modern discussion, and you're going to be much more familiar with it than me, but I'm only really familiar with it from this kind of look at Craig's cosmological argument and how the A theory is used there. Do you think dividing it into the A and B theory really captures the way that most of these philosophers historically would talk about it? Can you broadly, quite easily, say, well, this is like an A theory view or a B theory view, or are people thinking like so sort of conceptually differently about time that it's almost the modern discussion is something quite different?
It's an interesting question. I'm not totally sure it's one I'm that well equipped to answer.
Okay.
There's some really interesting stuff that's been written about this. So Ursula Coupe has a great book, Time for Aristotle, where she tries to get some interplay going between the contemporary notions, the A theory, B theory debate, and what we see in Aristotle. But I think it's hard to just read that straight in. And you then get discussions about how some of these A-B models map onto folks like Augustine and Aquinas. And I guess I'm not quite persuaded that it's that clean.
Yeah.
I mean, one way to think about the McTaggart piece that everyone loves to hate, that I'm actually very fond of, is that what it does is it really helps to surface two slightly different ways that we think about time. So on the one hand, we've got this A series notion of time of being this change of things first being future, then being present, and then being past. And that seems to involve what some folks want to call genuine change, right? There's a really substantive structural change that things undergo from having this feature of being future to having this feature of being present to having this feature of being past. And on the one hand, that seems quite intuitive. On the other hand, we have a B-theoretic notion of things just standing in fixed and permanent earlier than and later than relations. So the First World War is earlier than our talking. The First World War is later than the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and so on, to wheel out lots of the examples that are sometimes used. And that just doesn't change.
Mm.
And I guess it's, surfacing those two different notions about the way that we think about time is kind of helpful, because in some respects, I think you can see both of those notions sort of sloshing around in some earlier discussions about the nature of time. But because they're not quite so clearly differentiated, I think it makes making progress that little bit harder. As I say,
Right.
that's a history of philosophy claim that I'm not sure I'm intellectually equipped to substantiate if pressed.
Do you think then that what this distinction sort of does, maybe it might, I don't know, maybe you agree that time is unreal as a result of that argument, or maybe what it does is it sort of makes us think a bit more carefully about how we're interacting with the world and how we're using this concept of time, and then that enables us to sort of make philosophical progress going forward. Is that the way that you view the A and B theory argument, or what do you think time's unreal? What would that even mean?
Yeah, good. I think that I don't buy the conclusion of McTaggart's argument, or at least I don't think that the argument is is fully forceful. I do think, though, and I think this was pretty much your second option, that teasing apart these different concepts and different ways of thinking about time is useful conceptually, because it enables us to say, okay, so either, suppose we wanted to go the B theory route, okay, really time is B theoretic, okay, fine, but we have all of these A theoretic thoughts, those need explaining and understanding and unpacking. How are we going to do that? We have an experience of time that seems, say some people, to align more naturally with an A theoretic view. So how are we going to explain that? And so rather than having this sort of one slightly confused concept that's a bit A theoretic and a bit B theoretic, what we now have is two relatively cleanly defined topics and a whole host of explanatory projects that we need to try and engage in. And that makes making progress a whole heap easier, I think.
Do you think, do you have strong opinions about one of these views being true over the other one? I'm just thinking as you were talking, I don't know if this is your position, but I was getting this sense of maybe, they might sort of, obviously they can't both metaphysically be true if they absolutely contradict each other, but they both might be true in a sense that one might explain our sort of psychological experience, and one might sort of explain the way that the world is in and of itself, but I don't sort of live in a mind independent standpoint. Am I just reading that into the way you were describing some of these things, or is that?
No, I think that's a pretty fair way to describe what I was saying. So, the metaphysics of the world might be theoretic. Perhaps that's one way we could put it. But nonetheless, then we've got this series of experiences that look like, or they feel like, they're more atheoretic. So, as you say, we can't have these two contradictory things both be true. The world can't be atheoretic and be theoretic because they're mutually exclusive. So that means then we've got to go and explain this atheoretic stuff some other way, presumably just using B theoretic resources. So yeah, right. that would be the thought.
So do you take a position on this? Is it what are your current thoughts? Because you said you've been sort of mulling this over recently, thinking about these questions to do with physics. Has that led you in one particular direction?
Good. So it's led me in two directions, because okay. That's never take one direction when two are available. Yeah. So a lot of the work that I've done up until now really has been looking to defend what's normally described as a version of the A theory, which is presentism, from a whole host of objections. So often described as the view that only present objects exist, and I've written a bunch of stuff defending presentism from some objections, also raising some new objections to the view, but mostly looking to defend it from some objections. So that's one sort of bit of the research program. But with Sam Barron and Christy Miller, I've also been doing a fair bit of work on trying to unpack a bit of a different way of looking at the world, which is to say, what would it actually take for the reality to be timeless? And can we look to make sense of a timeless model that isn't atheoretic and that isn't B theoretic? And what would it take to make sense of that? And we've just finished putting together a draft of a book that's currently on someone's desk somewhere being evaluated as we speak, that look to try and make sense of some of those notions.
Is there an easy way to sort of introduce that concept? Because I guess I don't even know what that would look like on the face of it, you know, to say, yeah, like how, for example, there seems to be change that's happening, and that seems to be, my notion of time seems to be really closely connected to change happening. So when I think, you know, remove the time, it just sort of makes everything like static and nothing's happening, but there's not even really thoughts happen. Like what does it even look like to say no time, or time is an illusion in some sense?
Yeah. So all of the things that you've just said, right? There's no temporal structure. Things aren't changing. That's how the world really is. So I mean, a quick sketch of what we try and do in the book is to first do some empirical work and actually try and get a sense of what folk would say, or what folks do say, are the necessary and sufficient conditions for there being time in the world. And that turns out to be complicated and annoyingly hard and very difficult to make sense of. But really, to give you a kind of a rough idea about how you might make sense of this, if you go back to that B theoretic notion of time, where we said we've got these sort of instants of time and they're connected by this earlier than later than relation. To give you a bit of a metaphor, something to visualize, think about that as being a deck of cards that's lying on its side. So you can see all of the cards stacked up next to each other like that. And there's a temporal structure that's built into that, with each playing card separated from the one next to it via an earlier than later than relation. Okay, now take that deck of cards and just throw all the cards up in the air, with each card representing a moment. And they land, and they're not ordered in any interesting kind of way. They're just distributed. That's one way that the world could be and be timeless,
Right. Okay.
and that's an option.
That's really interesting. I guess I want to try and I want to try and think about it from a first person point of view, and that's rather than like a model of the way that reality is from a third person point of view, and that's really difficult for. I'm like, how could I don't understand how I could even be anything within that to make sense of like what would time look like from being in that world.
Yeah, I mean, from being in the world, it would look so being at any card, it would look exactly like the world would look to you exactly like it in fact does.
But it would sort of, like, would there be there wouldn't really be like the relation between one moment to the next, right? To make it seem, would it just be kind of jumpy around, like static on a screen craziness? Or
so I think the idea would have to be that at each moment, what you have built into your constant goings on, your appearances, is that sensation of things flowing from one moment to the next. Right. So at each moment, at each card, if you like, you've got to have that full and rich, seeming as if to you, being there and being available. Right. Otherwise, we'd just be denying the appearances, and we're not trying to do that. So yeah, that's it's interesting to kick about.
So I think what we can do, if I'll talk about causation a little bit, and then we've got at least I think there's 2 questions in the chat that we can go through at the end, which take maybe like 5-10 minutes or so. Sure. So if we talk about causation, then, so what is it for one object? What for one thing to cause another thing? I started talking about objects naturally because I'm thinking of one billiard ball hitting another. But what is it for something to be the cause of something else?
Okay, so cards on the table, I don't know. Not sure I have a convincing answer to that question, and I guess every now and again I just get frustrated and think there's no such thing as causation, and then I try and navigate the world around me, and I fail to believe that when I try and interact with things, because I need to turn the coffee machine on, right? I need to get some coffee, and I need to interact with the coffee machine. I need to make me a cup of coffee, and so on. So yeah, there are all sorts of interesting notions that I think are in the ballpark that we can use to try and elucidate a notion of causation. So for one thing, it looks like there's a really interesting notion of counterfactual dependence in play when we think about causation. So we want to say, okay, I want to say that the cause of the window breaking is the ball being thrown at it and striking it. So what do we say? We say, well, the ball was thrown and the window fell apart, and had the ball not been thrown, then it's not the case that the window would have fallen apart. Okay, fantastic. So there we're trying to elucidate this notion of causation via appeal to some sort of counterfactuals that we think are true. Had I not thrown the ball, then the window would not have broken. Because that's true, we want to say that the throwing of the ball is a cause of the window breaking, something like that. I mean, some challenges with that kind of view is that it looks to make causation oddly dependent on this series of counterfactuals rather than things going on in the world. It looks to make it dependent on things that are true about various possibilities rather than what in fact happens, which again, some folks aren't entirely comfortable with. And when we start to think about causation, we seem to sort of also intuitively start to think about things in terms of the production of some effects and the transfer of energy. So there's energy transfer theories around causation, whereby actually what you need to have the ball cause the breaking of the window is for there to be the right kind of transmission of energy between the ball and then the behavior of the window afterwards, and then that would be what gives rise to causation. But what you find is that for all of these analyses, there are counterexamples, edge cases that look problematic. And because you get all of those, none of the examples, none of the analyses look to come up as exactly capturing what we mean when we talk about causation. At least that's my concern.
Are there very kind of different kinds of causation that we're talking about here? And if there are, does that make the sort of attempt to subsume them all under one metaphysical theory difficult? You know, say if I'm talking about desirability of GameStop stock or something, causing the price to increase or something, that's a very different type of cause to I don't know, I let go of the water bottle so it falls kind of thing, which might be so is the attempt to I mean, I can use the same bit of language, I can say cause about both, but it seems what's going on there is very different, and maybe metaphysically it's something very different as well. Is that do you think there's something to that? Or
yeah, absolutely, it could be. I mean, it's some folks have suggested that what we actually need to have is, on the one hand, a physical theory of causation. So think about things that we talk about in our best science, for instance. Wherever you have some putative instance of causation there, give an analysis of that, sum all of those instances of causation that are going on in the physics and in sciences together, analyze those, that'll give you a physical notion of causation. Brilliant. Now let's go and talk about the GameStop cases and other cases, come up with a different notion. I guess I don't have any significant objection to proceeding in that kind of way. I worry about edge cases that are going to blur the distinction between the science on the one hand and the non-scientific on the other, and how we would demarcate that cleanly. And I guess I'm also kind of tempted by the idea that when I say that the desirability of GameStop stock causes particular patterns of behavior, and some quark fiddling about doing what it's doing causes something else, it's not totally clear to me I mean something different in those cases, at least on introspection. The causes themselves are fundamentally very different, but what it is that I'm saying seems to be something to do with production, bringing about, leading to something. All those metaphors I can grope for and not then give you an analysis of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I wonder. I don't know if there might not be a quick way of answering this, but there's been some talk that I've kind of listened to recently around the difference between like conceptual analysis and conceptual engineering, and like maybe this idea that analyzing our concepts can kind of like lead to us getting kind of trapped in our language, trapped in these kind of intractable problems, whereas maybe revising the philosophical method in some way might lead to more progress. Now, do you have strong opinions about that, or do you think maybe is this just another kind of fad that, you know, in 50 years time everyone will be back to conceptual analysis and that's the new thing?
yeah, we'll suddenly come back in 50 years and discover this really cool thing called conceptual analysis that people have forgotten about. Yeah. Well, I mean, that would certainly be consistent with the history of what's happened in trying to do metaphysics. You know, we move from one thing to the other, and hopefully we take what we've learned with us along the way. I guess I don't have particularly strong views. I'm fairly comfortable that we need to use our concepts to try and navigate the world. And I think that we do gain something by trying to analyze those concepts because we understand a bit more about them, and that makes them a bit more useful and enables us to do other things. So that sounds like something that we could reasonably do. On the other hand, I also think that because we are not primarily as creatures focused on doing metaphysics, we're primarily concerned with getting around in the world and staying alive and enjoying ourselves, that means that our concepts might not be that clean. They might not be that widely held. You might have one group of folks have a concept that isn't entirely shared by others. There might be this blurring of boundaries between them. And that might mean that what we should be doing is also a bit of this engineering work. I guess I'm not persuaded we need to sort of see them as foes in some gargantuan power struggle, so much as, you know, complementary tools that we can try and use to navigate the world around us.
Great.
So maybe I do have strong views. Maybe I just came upon a strong view there talking to you. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the strong views are that we've got to be, we should be modest and see the both in both positions. So if we move on to some questions then from the chat throughout. So Mitch has asked, can you ask Jonathan how the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis might or might not be useful with regard to metaphysics analysis from his view? Metaphysical analysis. I don't really know what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is.
And I'm struggling to remember it cleanly enough to give you a good answer to the question.
Linguistic relativity has come up in a quick. The hypothesis of linguistic relativity, also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the Whorf hypothesis or Whorfianism, is a principle suggesting that the structure of a language affects its speaker's worldview or cognition, and thus people's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. Okay, yeah, I think I've come across some of those examples before.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, at that level, yes, I'm familiar with the hypothesis. What I meant more is I'm not quite sure how. I'm not sure I remember enough of the details about how it plays out with the metaphysical theorizing that might go on underneath it.
Right.
I mean, yes, it's certainly true that the way that we experience the world is shaped by the concepts and ideas that we have, and vice versa, right? That's got to be true. But we can also revise those conceptual and linguistic structures in response to new data points. We can come to see the world in a different kind of way. So yeah, I don't really know exactly how that would be developed. It's not to say it's not an interesting question. It is an interesting question, but in order to give it a good answer, I want to go away and remind myself of about 8 papers before I come back.
Great. So Nathaniel has asked, could you discuss the shortcomings of Aquinas's grasp of metaphysics? I don't know, you might be a Thomist.
Shortcoming of Aquinas's grasp of metaphysics. Wow.
In 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, so I think that what Aquinas probably lacks is the formal tools with which, and the metaphilosophical background the metaphilosophical tools that we've got the advantage of now to try and then derive first order positions. I think that that's really where I'm going to say Aquinas is going to be most limited by position. But that's an unfortunate cultural artifact of position in history, right? That's not to say that there's anything.
Well, if we were to flip it round, is there anything you see in like Aquinas's philosophy that sort of, maybe modern philosophy kind of lacks or misses the mark on?
I can't say there's anything leaping to mind. I mean, yeah, no, nothing that's leaping out of my brain to respond to that. No.
So Melchior Deduza has asked, what do you think of post-metaphysics?
Post-metaphysics. Now, I've heard that word used to mean loads of different things, so I'm not sure what Melchior means by post-metaphysics here. Did you have any thoughts that might guide me at all, Nathan?
I don't really, other than what a quick Google search can bring up. Let's see.
It's one of those nasty terms that can be well. There's nothing wrong with the term. It's nasty in the sense that I've heard it used to pick out lots of different things.
Yeah, I've come across a very strange blog that's talking about hermeneutic communism. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Habermas is post-metaphysical thinking a critique.
Okay.
So maybe Habermas has something to say about this, and this person is critiquing it. Yeah, I'm not going to find anything too insightful, I don't think.
Okay. Here's one sort of thing that I've heard people use post-metaphysics to refer to, and this is a kind of a view where we don't need to have any metaphysics at all, right? So we literally move past metaphysics. We don't need to engage with it at all.
Right.
I guess that view I find a little bit tricky to maintain, just because I think that there is a world around me. I engage as if there's a world around me. As soon as I start investigating that, I'm making assumptions about categorical schemes, the kinds of things that there are, the structures of things around me. And as soon as, if you want to do any investigation or digging into that, it's really hard to get rid of all of those metaphysical assumptions. So, yeah.
Right. David Levy asks, can Lewis's modal realism resolve the truthmaker problem for presentism, that Caesar existed is true as in the closest possible world, the counterpart of Caesar concretely exists?
David, good. Can the modal realism solve that problem? I'm a philosopher. I can't say yes, right? But maybe is certainly true. I think that's absolutely one way that you could go. I think people have also tried to solve that problem without going as far as modal realism, and rather than talking about full concrete possible worlds, talking about ersatz possible worlds, and using those to try and solve the truth maker problem facing the presentist. So yes, it's an available solution. I think that there are some worries with going that way. Specifically, people normally want to try and put what's called an aboutness constraint on truth makers. So if I'm going to say that something makes true my talk about there being a pen on the desk, likely truth makers here include my pen and the desk. They don't include things like the clouds above me, right? It seems to be important that what makes true my claims are the things that my claims are about. And the worry with this kind of move that is sometimes described is that, you know, when I'm aiming to talk about the past, I'm not aiming to talk about something that's merely possible and exists in a different world. I'm aiming to talk about Caesar as Caesar poddled about in the past, crossing Rubicons and doing other things. But I mean, yes, absolutely, David. There's certainly mileage in exploring that option. When we start to get into other constraints on a good solution to the truth maker problem, then things get sticky. But things get sticky for all views. So yeah.
And then the last question from Greyback is, what exactly is present under presentism?
Right. So I think this is a great question. I've written papers trying to answer this question. And I actually think that, well, hang on a minute. So there could be two questions here, looking on the Greyback question. So I'm reading this question as asking what exactly is presentness under presentism? What does that consist in? And that's what I've written about. If the question is what exactly is present, so what are the things that get to count as present, the presentist will say that changes all of the time. So there are a bunch of things that are present now, and then a different set, and then a different set, and a different set, and so on. But what presence itself consists in is not something that presentists have had too much to say about. Normally they'll say something like it's a property. There's a property of presence, and that's what it is. I've tried to peddle a slightly different way of understanding it, which is to say that existence is presence. So when you talk about the existence of something, you're just picking out the same feature of the world as talking about the presence of something.
So someone said instantaneous nowness in the chat.
Yeah, that'll do.
And it looks like we also answered Melchior's question correctly. A world without metaphysics. So
cool.
Good. Awesome. So if we wrap up the conversation around there, it's been great having you on. The book, for those people who might be interested, is Metaphysics: An Introduction. Is second edition the latest edition? Is there a third edition?
It is, yeah. Nope.
And is there anywhere where people can kind of find you if they're interested in following your work? Or some people who have been, you said you're not teaching at the moment, but sometimes some people have been putting their lectures on YouTube and stuff and might be interested in people coming to watch them. Is there anything like that, a blog or something that you'd want people to go and read?
Absolutely. So if folks are interested in getting in touch on social media, on Twitter, I'm at Jonathan Tallant. Very happy to pick up with folks on there when I'm not in management meetings. If folks are interested in my work or looking at videos that I've done or reading papers of mine, jonathantallant.com is my website, and videos, interviews, papers, and links to books are all there. So feel free to have a rummage over that.
Great. And thanks for